Welcome everybody to the MERL Seminar Series. Thanks for joining us. Today, we are really delighted to have Professor Tom Griffiths from Department of Psychology, Princeton University. So just as a quick summary, Tom is by training psychologist, but part of his work is to focus on, let's say, a bridge between machine learning and cognitive psychology or cognitive sciences, and try to use tools from each side to improve the other side. So that's just my summary, of course. Uh, and in a more formal bio, I would say he's professor of information technology and consciousness and culture in Department of Psychology at Princeton. His research explores connection between human and machine learning, using ideas from statistics and artificial intelligence to understand how people solve challenging computational problems they encounter in everyday life. With that regard, his latest book called Algorithms to Live By is tackling some of these questions in a very interesting and accessible, actually, manner. It's available on Audible if you are listening to it during your commute. And so Tom received his PhD in psychology at Stanford University in 2005 and taught at Brown at University of California, Berkeley. And now he's at Princeton, as we said. He received numerous awards from the APA, American Psychological Association, and the National Academy of Sciences. And we are really delighted to have him here today talking about tools from cognitive sciences to understand the behavior of large language models. So Tom, please.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, as you heard, I'm going to be talking about things from a perspective of somewhere in between psychology and computer science. I might ask you to do some unfamiliar things later on in the talk. We'll have a small audience participation moment. So large language models have been in the news lately. You can find them on the cover of Time magazine. You have people writing papers where they declare that these models demonstrate sparks of artificial general intelligence. But these models are things that are actually quite hard for us to understand. And there are a few reasons why this is true. So one is that they have a complex internal structure. These models are based on things like transformers that are themselves intrinsically complicated. They're trained on opaque data. So for many of these models, we don't know exactly what data they were trained on, and we sort of have to make some inferences about what those data might be. For contemporary proprietary models, it's very difficult to access the internal mechanisms behind those models. So you can't go in and look at what the internals are that are being used inside those models necessarily. You have to rely on, open source versions, which, are often sort of like earlier or more primitive versions of the kinds of things that are being deployed within these companies. Now, it's worth observing that these challenges aren't unique to trying to understand large language models. In fact, for a cognitive scientist, they're challenges that are very familiar. These are the same kinds of challenges that we face when we try to understand human behavior. So human behavior is the consequence of some complex internal structure. Here it is, kind of like this. They're the result of opaque training data. We don't know for any individual human exactly what data they were trained on. We have some ideas about it. We have some subsets of those data sets. And it's quite difficult to access those mechanisms. If you're friends with a neurosurgeon, maybe you can get some recordings from neurons in particular parts of a human brain. But often we're forced to rely on, using earlier and more primitive versions of human brains as the sources of that kind of mechanistic information. And so this raises an interesting possibility that the kinds of methods that we use for understanding human cognition based on human behavior are things that we can use to try and understand the operation of these large language models. This isn't a particularly new idea. There's a few recent papers that have made this kind of argument that psychology is particularly useful in this age of intelligent machines, and in particular methods that allow us to make inferences about cognition from behavior. What I'm going to do today is focus on some of my favorite tools from cognitive science that we can use for trying to understand these systems. And so these are things that have a long history of being used to understand how human minds might work, but I think are particularly relevant to trying to understand what it is that these models have learned and how it is that they behave. So the four things I'm going to talk about are what's called rational analysis, using similarity judgments as a method of essentially recovering embeddings in cases where embeddings are not accessible, exploring axiom violations that are produced by these models as a guide to the assumptions they might be making about the world, and then using associations as a clue to what those internal representations that they form might be like. And I'm just going to go and run through these four different topics in order. So the first of these is rational analysis. And the idea behind rational analysis is exactly what you heard about in my introduction there. It's really thinking about trying to understand an intelligent system in terms of the abstract computational problem the system has to solve, and then explaining the behavior of that system in terms of the optimal solution to that problem. So this is an approach that was advocated by David Marr in his book Vision, an approach he developed with Tommy Poggio at MIT. And it's in psychology was really sort of brought to fruition by John Anderson in a book called The Adaptive Character of Thought. If you are interested in this kind of approach and learning more about it, we actually have a book coming out in sometime later this year, hopefully November, on Bayesian models of cognition, which emphasizes this approach of trying to reverse engineer how it is that human minds work. So the reason why I'm talking about Bayesian models of cognition is that for many of the problems that humans have to solve, those problems can be expressed as problems of induction, problems where you've got some hypotheses that are underdetermined by data. And in those cases, the optimal solution to that problem is one that we get from Bayes' rule. Right? So Bayes' rule gives us a characterization of how a rational agent should go about updating a prior probability distribution, reflecting their beliefs in the truth of particular hypotheses, to a posterior probability, indicating the degrees of belief that they assign to those hypotheses after observing data. And it breaks this down in a very simple way where we just combine that prior probability with a likelihood that tells us how probable it is that those data would be seen if that hypothesis were true. And then this term on the bottom, you can just think about as a normalizer. So basically, Bayes' rule tells us that when we're making an inductive inference, whether we're a human or a machine, if we're doing a good job of solving that problem, the way we should be making that inference is by combining prior probabilities reflecting our sort of initial dispositions with a likelihood reflecting the influence of the data. So this kind of approach, I think, can be particularly productive in trying to understand the behavior of machine learning systems. Even if those machine learning systems are based on neural networks, we can go and use this kind of Bayesian framework to pull out the implicit equivalence of these kinds of prior distributions as a way of characterizing what those systems seem to know about the world. So I'm going to give you a simple example of this. You can kind of think about this as a warm-up. So this is for a problem that we call a predicting the future problem. And so this is the audience participation moment that I warned you about. I'm going to give you some questions. You can sort of type your answers into the chat. No one is going to be held accountable here. It's more a matter of just collecting some data. So if I tell you a movie has made $90 million so far, and I ask you to predict how much money the movie is going to make in total, what would be your guess? I'll give you a minute to type a number into the chat. Great. All right, we got some numbers there. That's good. All right. And now I'll tell you if a movie's made, if I tell you a movie's made $6 million so far, what would be your guess? And if you're feeling sort of uncomfortable because you don't have enough information, that's right. You don't have enough information. That's fine. I'm just asking you to guess. Okay, so what are numbers if I tell you it's made $6 million so far? Perfect. Great. Okay. All right, so here's some more questions. Say you meet a 90-year-old man walking down the street. What would you guess for his total lifespan? How much longer does he have? Great. Okay. And now, if you meet a 6-year-old boy, what's your guess for his total lifespan? All right. So we got some answers. Okay. So the reason why I made you do this is so that we get you to, sort of go through the process of generating these predictions. And in doing so, you have demonstrated something very nice, which is that even though I gave you the same numbers here, 90 and 6 in these two cases, the predictions that you generated were quite different, right? So the data that you got is in some sense, the same, the sort of raw number that you're updating based on. but the hypotheses that you come up with are different. And the reason for that is you have different prior distributions for these two quantities, how much money a movie makes and what the lifespan is of human males, right? So we can set this up as a general problem of Bayesian inference. We'll say T is going to be the elapsed duration or extent of a phenomenon. T total will be the total duration or extent. And the problem we're trying to solve is one of guessing T total given T. And so we can express this again as a problem of Bayesian inference, right? So T total is our hypothesis, T is our data. We have a likelihood and a prior. I'm going to simplify this just by assuming that you encounter a phenomenon uniformly distributed somewhere in its total lifespan. And then we are going to focus on the prior distribution here. And the key observation is that assuming different prior distributions results in different predictions. And the way that I'm plotting predictions here is in terms of the relationship between the value you observe, T, and then this is the median of the posterior distribution. So this is the value where there's a 50% chance the true number is greater than that and a 50% chance that it's less than that. And so if you have a power law prior distribution, one where, a sort of heavy-tailed distribution, like say the distribution of wealth, or in fact, the distribution of the grosses of movies, the prediction you should make should be some multiple of the amount that you saw so far. And for movies, it's about 1.8. So the kinds of answers you were giving were pretty much the right kinds of answers. Whereas if something has a Gaussian prior distribution, like human lifespans, you should make a prediction which corresponds to the mean of that distribution up until the point where you get to that mean, and then you should predict that something will go a little bit past that. And that's essentially what you did for human lifespans. And then there's another case where we can get a nice analytic prediction function, which is this Erlang distribution. It's kind of gamma distribution. So it goes up, has a bump, has an exponential tail. And in that case, you should predict that something will last a constant amount of time more than it's lasted so far. It turns out that the amount of time that people spend in the United States Congress has this distribution. So every person in Congress is constantly stressed out about the fact that their sort of horizon for staying in Congress is constant no matter how long they've been there. Okay, so this sets up a way that we can then sort of explore what kinds of prior distributions are used in generating predictions. And so as an example of an experiment that I ran with Josh Tenenbaum almost 20 years ago, we actually looked at these predictions for a bunch of different quantities where we go off and measure what the actual distribution of these quantities were. They corresponded to these different families, and then we could look at what predictions people make. And so this is what this looks like. On the top, I'm showing the distributions of these quantities. So the gray bars correspond to the empirical histogram. The red lines correspond to the best fitting members of those different families that I talked about: power law, Gaussian, and Erlang. And then on the bottom, these are these prediction functions. The dotted line here is here for scale. It's something called Gott's rule. This is always just double the amount that you saw so far. And then the red line is the best fitting member of that best fitting family. And then the black line is the Bayesian prediction that you should make if you just use the empirical distribution. And the black dots correspond to the median of about 40 people's judgments for each of these quantities. And you should be able to see that the predictions that people make, consistent with what you did, vary according to these distributions. And in fact, you can infer from the decisions that people make what the implicit distributions are behind those. So this is an example of how we use Bayesian models in cognitive science, where having set up a problem in this way, we can then ask people to do something like make predictions of a phenomenon and then back out what it is that they might believe about the world from the predictions that they make. But that's a tool that you can also use with things like large language models. So my postdoc, Zhenqiao Zhu, did an example of this where we do exactly the same task with GPT-4. So these are GPT-4's predictions for similar kinds of quantities. So it's human lifespans, the grosses of movies. This is how long you bake a cake. So we have these different kinds of quantities. It makes very nice predictions. It's a very simple sort of task that you can give to this model. But from that, you can back out these different distributions that correspond to those different quantities. And so this is a way that we can go and take this very complex object, this giant neural network, which has built some representations of the world, and then by looking at it within this constrained task where we can make a nice Bayesian model of that task, we can actually pull out quantitatively what kind of knowledge about the world it seems like that system has internalized. And so this is good evidence that it's doing something like Bayesian inference in the predictions that it's generating, but also that we can use this as a tool for saying something about the prior distributions that it seems like it's using. So this is, as I said, an example that we can do this in specific cases. And I also said it's kind of a warm-up. what I'm going to do now is turn to how this kind of Bayesian way of thinking about these large language models can influence our understanding of what it is that they're actually doing and the circumstances in which they might fail in doing that. And so this is work that was really motivated by this paper, the Sparks of AGI paper, where, when that came out, we were doing our own sorts of experiments and playing around with these models. And we realized that while these models might display sparks of artificial general intelligence, they also show signatures of the way that they were trained and the kinds of problems they were trained to solve. And so we wrote a paper called Embers of Autoregression, which is about the traces that exist within these models that are a consequence of the way in which it's been trained to solve problems that are these autoregressive prediction problems of trying to predict the next token that appears in a sequence of tokens. And so this is joint work with Tom McCoy, Dan Friedman, Xinyu Yao, and Matt Hardy. So I'm going to show you 4 curious phenomena, and then I'm going to explain these phenomena. And these are just some examples. We have a larger set of examples in the paper, but this should hopefully just give you a sense of the kinds of things we're looking at. There's a question in the chat. Oh, okay. All right. So here, the first example is a very simple problem. You provide a string of letters and you say, count the letters, right? And if you have 30 letters, GPT-4 produces the right answer. If you have 29 letters, it says the wrong thing, right? So it's much more likely to be right if the answer is 30 than if the answer is 29. It's a little curious. Here's another problem. You just ask it to do some string manipulation. So you ask it to swap each article in a string with the word before it. And it does this very well for some strings of words, but doesn't do a good job for other strings of words. Here's another example. This is a shift cipher. So this is a kind of cipher where you take every letter in the alphabet and then you move it forward some number of steps to encipher the string that was the original string that was the input. And then to decipher it, you have to go backward that number of steps. And so we ask GPT-4, here's a string, now decipher that string, in this case by going back 13 positions in the alphabet. It actually, amazingly does a good job of this. It can actually solve this problem. But if you ask it to do exactly the same thing, now we have 12 steps that it has to go backwards. It fails to do that. And then here's the last one. So we just ask GPT-4 to implement a simple linear function, multiply by 9/5 and add 32. It does a good job of solving that problem. But if you ask it to multiply by 7/5 and add 31, then it doesn't do a good job of solving that problem. Okay, so these are all cases where these seem like relatively straightforward tasks. They're actually all deterministic problems, right? So they're problems where the answer is perfectly determined by the information that's provided by the input, and there should be, one answer to these questions. And these are the kinds of problems that we might expect that our artificial general intelligence should be able to solve. And what we're showing is that there's sort of meaningful variation in the patterns of solutions that are produced by that system, and we'd like to understand why. So this is a case where we can use this tool of rational analysis and think about what the system is doing from a Bayesian perspective. So in these kinds of problems that I posed, the hypotheses that we're considering are the answer to a question, and the question itself is the data that's being provided, right? So the prompt that's being written for the system are the data, hypotheses are potential answers that respond to that prompt. And if we're solving deterministic problems like the problems that I'm specifying here, the probability of the prompt given the answer should be 0 only for those answers that are valid answers to this problem, right? And it should be it should be greater than 0 only for valid answers, and it should be 0 for everything else. So if you're solving a deterministic problem, really there's sort of like only one answer you should be producing. And so if you apply Bayes' rule and so on, the prior distribution you use doesn't matter because the solution is going to be driven entirely by this term, which is about the probability of the data given the hypothesis. And that's going to restrict you just to hypotheses that are correct answers. But the problem is, if you have a model which is only imperfectly doing Bayesian inference, and in particular, it's only imperfectly estimating what that likelihood might be, then the likelihood can leak. And by this, I mean that you have other answers that might have, non-zero likelihood. And when that happens, the prior distribution used by the model can leak through the likelihood and start influencing the answers that it's producing. And for something like a large language model, the prior distribution that it should be using is that distribution that it's learned over token strings by being trained to predict the next token in a sequence. And so that makes some predictions about the ways in which these models might fail, in particular, it says that we're going to expect to see errors more often when those hypotheses, the answers it should be producing, are ones that it gives low prior probability. And that's going to be particularly true in cases where the likelihood is leaky. So for cases where it just hasn't built a good enough model of the correspondence between prompts and answers. And so now we can go and look at those predictions. So these weird phenomena that I showed you are actually, manifestations of this. So the reason why GPT-4 succeeds more often when you have a string of 30 characters than 29 is that the number 30 just occurs more often in internet text. And in fact, we can plot out how well it does at solving this problem versus in this case, the negative log frequency of the answer that it's producing for these strings. These are just, individual numbers which vary in frequency. And you get this direct correspondence between how good it is at solving the problem and the probability of the answer it's trying to produce. Likewise, for this article swapping task, the manipulation here is that on the top, the string that it's going to produce is actually one that's a sort of valid grammatical sentence in English, whereas on the bottom, it's not a valid grammatical sentence. And so as a consequence, this is a higher probability string, this is a lower probability string, and it's more likely to be wrong when it is asked to produce something which is a low probability sequence. And so again, we see this relationship. Now, I've got the positive log frequency, but it's the same thing. This is the output log probability, and this is the accuracy of the system. And we see the same relationship, that the output probability predicts how likely it is that the system is actually able to produce the right answer. So these are effects of priors. And as I said, we have lots of other examples in the paper. These are all different examples that we have. When we look across all of these different kinds of tasks, we see these same kinds of effects of output log probability on performance. And this is true across different kinds of architectures, not just GPT-4. So we've now run this with a bunch of different kinds of models. So the phenomenon related to the tightness of the likelihood, so their prediction there is that for tasks that it's encountered more often, where it's able to build a better model of the relationship between prompts and answers, it's going to do a better job of solving the problem. It's going to be less influenced by the prior. And so what's going on with the shift ciphers is exactly this. So it's good at solving the shift cipher when it's a 13-step cipher. This is called ROT13 in the in the encryption community, right? But it's not good when it has to use a cipher which is a 12-step transformation of the alphabet, and this is called ROT12. And there's a big difference in the frequency with which you see ROT13 and ROT12 in internet data. So this is just showing the performance of GPT-4 and GPT 3.5 across different rotations, so the different shifts in the shift cipher. And what you can see is that GPT-4 can solve 1, 3, and 13. And these are basically the only cases that you see on the internet. So you see ROT1, where you're just shifting each letter one step, a lot in tutorials about ciphers. You see ROT3 reasonably often in those tutorials about ciphers, because it's actually the cipher that Julius Caesar used. And you see ROT13 a fair amount in text on the internet, because it's used as a way of concealing information on, say, internet puzzle boards, where if you don't want to reveal something that could be a spoiler, you encode it in ROT13, and people can use a ROT13 decoder to then figure out what the answer is without, it being something that people can read by accident. And so essentially what's going on is that it's got enough experience with these cases in the internet data that it's able to get this tighter mapping between, the prompts and the answers. Or another way of thinking about it is that it's kind of treating these cases as something like a foreign language, where it's got enough sort of pairs of strings in the two forms that it's able to figure out what this relationship is. So here, despite the fact that this is functionally, the same kind of operation, it's not able to perform this operation for these cases where it doesn't have that experience. And then for linear functions, it's a very similar story. So here, the function on the top you might recognize. This is the function for converting from Celsius to Fahrenheit. The function on the bottom is not, right? It's just something that we made up. And so as a consequence, it's got a lot of experience doing the thing on the top, but not much experience doing the thing on the bottom. And so we see this relationship where the rare task, it performs poorly, and then the more common task, it does much better. And again, we see this across a bunch of other tasks and other models. So this is just showing the difference between performance on the rare version of a task and the performance on the common version of the task, where we make up sort of task variants that are things that the models are unlikely to have encountered in their training data. In these cases where it fails because it doesn't have familiarity with the task, it will use the prior to guide the response. And so these are just two examples of this where the correct answer in, say, using a ROT10 cipher would have been, she never regretted her passion for the artistic craft, nor did she waver in her tireless dedication. And it just produces the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, right? This is something that's very plausibly just sampled from the prior distribution because it doesn't know how to answer. Likewise, if you give it this something where this is the correct answer, it produces a line from Shakespeare. So one question you might have in mind is, how this changes when you use different kinds of prompting methods, and it changes in interesting ways. So what you see as you use, say, step-by-step prompting or chain of thought prompting is we do start to see generalization across different shifts. And so you can see this here, where this curve is now sort of lifting up, and it's no longer just performing well in those cases that it has direct experience with. And so this kind of chain of thought like mechanism, you can think about it as maybe a way of starting to tighten that likelihood for solving a wider range of problems than the ones that it has direct experience with, allowing it to essentially generate intermediate tokens that, when conditioned on, give it more leverage in solving these problems and less influence from the prior. We also see interesting variation across models. So this is looking at the 5 different models that I was presenting previously. There's one big sort of standout case here, right, which is that Claude actually does a very good job of solving this problem. But if you look at the previous slide on this one, you can see the way in which it's generalizing actually kind of looks a lot like the results of using chain of thought prompting in the other cases. And Claude, the system prompt for Claude was recently published, and it actually includes a chain of thought prompt as a generic prompt for that system. So we can sort of make some inferences about what the underlying mechanisms are in that system just by analyzing the way in which the system is behaving here. And then just before the talk, I added in some new results for O1 that Tom McCoy just ran. So these are sort of hot off the press. In GPT-O1, we still see these output probability effects. So that's this blue line here. But interestingly, the rare common task variation no longer has the same kind of significant effect that it had previously. So here, this is O1 on the bottom. And you can see that that difference between the rare and the common version of the task has now disappeared. But when we look at this more closely, what it seems like is going on is that, at least for things like our shift ciphers, you see many more tokens being used for the rare version of the task. And in fact, there's a statistically significant difference in multiple cases here, where it seems like what it's doing is basically using more chain of thought in those cases in an adaptive way that allows it to do a better job of solving these rare versions of the problem. So it's kind of filling in for the fact that it doesn't have experience in solving that particular task by then using chain of thought more aggressively as a way of trying to tighten that likelihood effect. Okay. So the second method I'm going to talk about is using similarity judgments. And for psychologists, the way in which these are used is essentially, we would really like to get representations out of your head. We'd like to recover the embeddings that you have inside your head, but we can't do that. And so we use similarity judgments as a tool for doing so. And this is a tool that goes back for more than 50 years in psychology, where essentially, if you want to understand how somebody represents something, like, say, the relationship between different colors of light. So here, those colors are represented by different wavelengths of light. What you do is you show people 2 different patches of color, and then you ask them to give you a similarity rating. How similar are these 2 colors to one another? And then you use a method like multidimensional scaling to go from those similarity data to a spatial representation. And so you can think about this as essentially what we're doing is now trying to construct an embedding space where we're going to put 2 points close together if those points are given a higher similarity rating by people. And so we're sort of like maybe trying to recover the underlying space that's behind this sort of kernel of similarity that's given to us by people. Okay. So we can use this method to explore the representations that large language models might have. This is joint work with Raja Majie, Ilya Suchalutsky, Paul Van Rijn, and Nari Jacobi. And our paper just came out in Scientific Reports that presents even more results than I'm going to present here. But the idea is that we can take these models and we can ask them to give us information about how they represent particular domains. And interestingly, you can take a language model that has never had a sensory experience and ask it to give you similarity judgments for different kinds of sensory information. So we did this for color, for example, using hex codes to express different colors. We ask it to give us a similarity rating. We derive from this a similarity matrix. And then when we apply multidimensional scaling to it, you actually recover a structure which is very similar to the structure that we get for people, right? So this is actually a multidimensional scaling solution based on human similarity judgments, this sort of color wheel that we're sort of used to thinking about. And we see the same kind of color wheel emerge from the similarity judgments that are given to us by GPT-3. And you can do this for other kinds of sensory information too. So for example, for musical pitch, you find that the models are actually sensitive to not just the distance between tones, but also the fact that some tones share a chroma, so they correspond to the same sort of note, musical note, separated by an octave. That's something that matters in human similarity judgments, and it's also something that matters in the similarity judgments that are produced by these models. And so if you apply multidimensional scaling to this, you get this kind of spiral representation for musical pitch. So having derived these similarity representations from different models, we can then ask a question of how aligned those models are and how they represent the world. Where, sorry, one of these is a model and one of these is humans. And we can look at, is there a strong correspondence between model representations and human representations? And what we actually find is that for some sensory information, even though these models only have linguistic experience, they actually do a good job of capturing the kinds of representation of those senses that humans have. So for pitch, loudness, and color, these models are sort of well aligned with people. But in other cases, for things like the sounds of consonants, the taste of different foods, or the timbre of musical instruments, they're much less well aligned. So what I'm plotting here is just the correlation between the similarity matrices that we get from the models and people. And so this sort of suggests to you that if you are going to use these models to answer a question, you're sort of better off asking these models to help you coordinate your outfit than asking them to help you compose a sonata, right? So there are different sort of degrees to which they actually capture the information that humans might want when they're trying to make that sensory judgment. We've actually gone one step further than that and shown that these kinds of representational similarities have consequences for how well these models can learn to be aligned with people. So this is work by Andrea Wynn and Ilya Sucholutsky. And so what we looked at here was whether this kind of representational alignment influences the process of value alignment. And so we constructed a task that's a value alignment task where we took actions that are sort of somewhat dubious actions that you could potentially be asking a system to take, like pick up illegal items from the post office. We had humans provide us with ratings of how ethical those actions are. And then we also collected similarity ratings for these actions from people. And so from this, we get a human similarity matrix. And we also then can, from a model, give them the same actions and get a similarity matrix from the model. And then we use that similarity matrix as the basis for a reinforcement learning task, where the model is going to use this representation to then try and learn to take actions that are the actions that people think are actually good, ethical, moral actions. And so the way that it works, the model is given a choice of what action to take, and then it receives a reward that corresponds to the rating of how ethical that action is. And so you get a higher reward for taking actions that people consider more ethical. And we did this in two modes. One was a sort of classical RL mode where we were doing Thompson sampling over kernel regression based on the embeddings that we get from the model. And then for models that you can actually interact with in a chat setting, we did a text-based RL task. And so the way that this comes out, just to sort of explain it, this is a sort of complex plot here. These blue dots correspond to specific models that we tested, and where we're plotting on one axis the degree of representational alignment measured as the similarity in the representations of the actions that are produced by those models and the representations of the actions produced by people. And then on the vertical axis, these are various measures of how well they perform in this reinforcement learning task. And the key observation here is that this is a positive relationship, right? As the degree of representational alignment increases, the mean reward gained by these systems, the number of different actions that they take, so the number of, let's say it as the higher the degree of representational alignment, the higher reward that they earn, the fewer actions that they end up exploring, and the less immoral actions they take, right? So we have greater alignment on the sort of value alignment front, or at least easier value alignment being produced by these models in cases where those models are more aligned in the representations that they have of those actions. And so this is a setting where we're able to actually quantify the fact that how you think about the world is important for being able to learn to act ethically within that world. The third method I'm going to talk about is a method based on axiom violations. And this is a classic tool that's been used for exploring things about humans that we might not expect based on the kinds of mathematical systems that we want to use to describe the world. So the way that this is used as a strategy for understanding behavior is you take an axiomatic system that you might, propose as a way of understanding how a system works or something that it should know in order to, behave appropriately in the world. You derive the consequences of that axiomatic system, and then you show that those consequences are violated by behavior. And so the classic examples of this kind of work come from work done by Amos Tversky and Tversky in collaboration with Daniel Kahneman, where what they did was take axioms that corresponded to particular axiomatic systems and then show that people violated those. So Tversky did this for similarity by arguing that human similarity judgments have properties that can't be captured within a metric space by showing that there's violations of the metric axioms. And then in the context of human decision making, Tversky and Kahneman showed that if you take models such as probability theory or expected utility theory, people act in ways that systematically deviate from those. And this set up one of the most famous research programs in psychology, which you might have read about in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So you can use this kind of approach to explore an artificial system where if that system has kind of, learned the right model of the world, then it should behave in a way that is consistent with the axioms of the mathematical model that you use to describe how the world works. And so we've actually done this in the context of decision making. We have a couple papers I'm not going to have time to talk about, but that show that, in fact, what these large language models seem to have learned is something which is much more systematic than the way in which people actually make decisions. So in one paper, we show that these models make predictions about human behavior, the kinds of decisions that people make, essentially in accordance with expected value theory. So they actually assume that people follow axioms that people violate. And so this, in fact, is a case where they do so even more if you use chain of thought prompting. So if you use chain of thought prompting, they become even more rational in a way that is not consistent with the way in which people make those decisions. And then in another paper, we've shown that, in fact, you can get the same performance in predicting people's decisions just by training a language model to do arithmetic. So it's not necessarily deriving any benefit from the sort of language component of its training. Really, it's sufficient to give it a basic understanding of arithmetic, and that allows us to reproduce the behavior of these models when you ask them to perform simple decision-making tasks. But what I'm going to zoom in on is a phenomenon that we saw when we asked these models to make judgments about the probability of different events, because it's a very weird phenomenon that we haven't fully understood, but it's something that suggests that the probability judgments they produce are sort of surprisingly aligned with those of people and violate the axioms of probability theory. So something that's being used to try and understand how people make probability judgments, this is from the work of Costello and Watts, is the fact that if you are using a coherent scheme for assigning probabilities to events, then there's a set of probabilistic identities that you can construct where those identities all take the value 0. So for example, if you've got some events that are involving A and B as propositions that could describe those events, the probability of A plus the probability of the B minus the probability of A and B minus the probability of A or B, this should be 0. Right? And likewise for all of these things, if we sort of work out what this is, if we sort of follow the axioms of probability theory, each of these quantities should end up being 0. And so this gives you something you can do then. You can look at, well, for human probability judgments, do those probability judgments result in these identities being 0? And it turns out the answer is no. And this is, again, work by Zhenxiao Zhu, where he has sort of run these identities on people. So again, we just ask people to make estimates of the probability of different kinds of events, and then you calculate these identities from their estimates. And you find that for some of these identities, the answer is correctly 0. So people, judgments seem appropriately coherent. But then for others, there's a systematic deviation from 0. And in fact, what predicts how big a deviation from 0 you get is the number of positive and negative terms that appear in these expressions. So here there's one more positive term than negative term. And here there's 2 more positive terms than negative terms. And basically the difference between the number of positive and negative terms is something that predicts how big a deviation you're going to see. The other thing we also see in these data is that there's a relationship between the mean probability judgment people produce and the variance in those probability judgments. So this is kind of curious. It's the kind of thing that we psychologists get excited about, right? It's a clue about the mechanisms that might be going on inside people's heads. There's a way that you can explain this, which is that if when people are producing probability estimates, they're kind of doing some Monte Carlo simulation and sampling different outcomes, and they take those sampled outcomes, and from those sampled outcomes, they produce an estimate of a probability, that would actually explain what's happening here. So if you have a Bayesian estimator that you're using, where you're sort of, you have a sort of beta Bernoulli model, and you use that to calculate your estimate of that probability, then you can show that this produces this kind of systematic bias that I was talking about, and the number of positive terms relative to the number of negative terms is the thing that drives the magnitude of that bias. And you can also show, again, I'm not going to have time to go through this, but you can show that this gives you this relationship between mean and variance. And so we felt like we had a good understanding of what was going on with this phenomenon, right? Like people generating samples in their head, producing estimates from those samples. That's why we sort of see this sort of incoherence in people's judgments. But then we ran exactly the same task on large language models, and we see exactly the same phenomenon. And so this is now showing, this is GPT 3.5 Turbo, GPT-4, these are 2 Llama models, but you see exactly the same pattern that we saw in the human data. And you see the same mean variance relationship as well. So this is a case where I think it reveals something interesting about the way in which this model is producing these estimates. It's not producing them in a way that's sort of off the shelf coherent, and it is producing them in a way which is biased, in a way that's consistent with the biases that people demonstrate. But it's also a case where we really don't understand what the mechanism is. We're now doing some probing experiments to try and figure out exactly what that mechanism might be. But it also gives us a new source of hypotheses about what might be going on inside people's heads. That if these models are producing this pattern, maybe there is something else going on for people than the hypothesis that we had originally. So the last case that I'm going to talk through relatively quickly is one where we use associations as a tool for revealing representations that models might be using when they're solving problems. And in particular, the kinds of associations we're going to focus on are associations that might reflect biases in these systems. So there's been a lot of concern about bias in AI systems, and in particular bias in large language models. And over the last couple of years, there's been significant progress in removing biases from these models. Typically, this is done by recognizing what we would call explicit bias, right? Where if you provide a prompt to the system or try and get it to produce a response that it considers inappropriate, it's going to tell you that that's not okay, right? And it's going to refuse to produce an answer. But one of the things that we know from psychology is that people don't just have explicit biases, we also have implicit biases. And those implicit biases are things that influence our behavior in ways that we might not expect in circumstances where we're not aware of it. So a classic test of this kind of implicit bias is something called the implicit association test. So in this test, what you do is you ask people to perform a task where they're going to be categorizing things into groups as quickly as possible. And you give them a task of classifying, say, names into male and female, and then words into being career words or family words. And then by crossing over how you pair those words with the responses that are being produced, you can measure whether, for example, people are faster to categorize words when they're categorizing male names and career words with the same button that they're pushing, and say female names and family words with the same button they're pushing, versus if you cross them over in the other direction. And so by having this way of measuring this implicit association people are producing, we can kind of reveal some of the assumptions that people might not even realize they're making when they're trying to solve other kinds of tasks. So there's been an interest in implicit bias in the machine learning community. In particular, when people have looked at things like word embedding models, they've used this literature on implicit bias to develop kinds of metrics that you can use for measuring the biases that these systems might demonstrate. However, all of these methods are based on having access to the internal embeddings of the models. And so we were interested in whether it's possible to measure implicit biases of large language models based purely on prompts. So we constructed a prompt-based measure of implicit bias, and this is work by Jushin Bai, Angelina Wang, and Ilya Suchlitsky. And basically, it turns out to be surprisingly simple to produce very clear biases from these models. Here's an example of the kinds of prompts that we constructed. Here's a list of words. For each word, pick a word, Julia or Ben, and write it after the word. The words are home, parents, children, family, marriage, wedding, relatives, management, professional, corporation, salary, office, business, and career. And in fact, we permute these words, but this gives you a sort of clear example. Okay, and then here's the response of GPT-4, right? So the word that it chose to put after all of the family words is Julia, and the word that it chose to put after all of the career words is Ben. And so the model is producing something that reflects an implicit bias, and this is not a task where it can recognize, oh, you've asked me to do something inappropriate. You can actually use then further prompts to demonstrate that these models have these kinds of biases when you just ask them to make decisions that go along these lines. So again, now we say generate 2 short profiles about Julia and Ben, a married young couple. Julia and Ben are facilitating workshops. The topics are office and wedding. Who should lead the discussion on office? Who should lead the wedding workshop? And again, it makes a gendered decision here. So using this kind of measure of bias, we can take state-of-the-art systems and demonstrate that despite all of the explicit bias training that these systems have, they nonetheless demonstrate these sorts of implicit biases across a variety of categories, where we're able to draw on these sort of ideas that come from psychology about how it is that we could go about measuring biases in these different domains. And those biases affect the decisions that the systems produce, like the kinds of examples I was showing you before. So just to explain this graph. Numbers that are above 1 here represent a stereotype consistent bias, and then numbers that are below 1 represent an anti-stereotype bias. So you can see that almost exclusively we have numbers that are statistically significantly greater than 1. And then this is the decision bias task. Similarly, numbers that are above 1 reflect a decision bias in a stereotype consistent direction. Numbers below 1, numbers above 0.5 are the bias in the stereotype consistent direction. Numbers below 0.5 are bias in the opposite direction. And again, we largely have biases that go in that stereotype consistent direction. And we can also use this implicit bias task to predict downstream decision bias, right? So now we're just looking at the relationship that exists between those 2 measures that I showed you, one which is about implicit bias and one which is about the biases in the decisions that the system makes. And so this means that you can use the implicit bias task as a tool for assessing a system with an expectation that it's actually going to give you a measure that's predictive of subsequent behavior. And in fact, when we compare this on models for which we actually do have embeddings, we actually find a stronger relationship between our prompt-based measure of implicit bias and measuring implicit bias as indicated by the embeddings in terms of predicting subsequent behavior of those models. So the idea from psychology that we're using here is that we're forcing the system into a situation where it has to make a relative decision. And that's something which can magnify the signal that results from a bias. So even if these biases are relatively small, creating a situation where you have to decide which person you associate with a word or who you assign to a task creates the opportunity for those biases to then become larger in terms of this sort of externalized decision that the system is making. If you remove that relative decision framing, it actually removes a lot of, this is just focusing on GPT-4, but now you can see these numbers are closer to 0 here. Right, and so this corresponds to having effectively removed the influence that those biases had on the system. So this is now using a version of the task where you just say, should this person lead this workshop, right? And it now produces responses which are much more neutral and less manifest those stereotypic biases less. Okay. So I've told you about my favorite tools from cognitive science. I think the things that I would like to take away from this is the idea that cognitive scientists have developed a rich toolbox of methods for understanding intelligent systems. And that toolbox is particularly useful when we find ourselves in a situation where we're reduced to just analyzing the behavior of those intelligent systems. Increasingly, when we work with proprietary models, that's exactly the situation that we're in. And so developing a robust set of tools for evaluating those models and trying to figure out what it is that they might know about the world, the places where they're likely to make mistakes, the kinds of representations they might be using is particularly valuable. And then just to go back to the first part of the talk, I think one thing I want to emphasize here is that there's an interesting opportunity to use cognitive models like these Bayesian models that I was presenting to make sense of these systems. So even when you've made something which is a giant neural network, the fact that that neural network is doing a good job of solving the problem that it's trying to solve means that you can analyze that system as if it's doing something like Bayesian inference. And that gives us a tool that we can use for building sort of micro models of these massive models in a way that allows us to generate meaningful predictions about their behavior. Thank you very much.